Why do you think it's important for people to have a deep understanding of history?
Well, because I think if they want to understand current events, they have to understand history, right? I mean, to understand things like context or causation, I think you have to understand it's like trying to understand why a row of dominoes is falling and only focusing on the one that's falling right now, right? You kind of have to look back and see how this whole catastrophe started with the very first domino to get it. I mean, for example, let's imagine you are watching what's going on in Western China, right? Between the Chinese government and the Uyghur people. How are you going to understand that without going into some of the background? Or let me take it in a totally different direction, because I think people think of history and think about things like that. But I mean, even if we're talking about something like computer development or car development, you kind of need to go back and see how this model came before that model and that model came from. In other words, there's this line of succession in terms of this happens, then this happens, then this happens that helps you understand anything. And I think that's how people basically, create a framework for how they understand reality anyway. So to me, understanding the past is important for understanding the present.
And you bring historical events to life in a way that is both engaging and very informative. In your opinion, how does storytelling help us to better understand and connect with history?
Well, I think it's the traditional method, right? So if you go to there's a lot of traditional societies around the world where people still learn about their past from storytellers who go from place to place to place and tell the very dramatic story of their people's past. There's a novelist named E.L. Doctorow, and he had a line that I really liked once. He said, "The historian will tell you what happened, and the novelist will tell you what it felt like." And I feel like something like what a storyteller like I do is combining those two things. We'll give you the names and dates, we'll give you the background, we'll tell you about the leading figures and the movers and the shakers, but then we're going to get into, some of the people involved in the story, right? And that's what a novelist would do too, get into the minds of people, the emotions. And a lot of times with more modern stories, you have a lot of information you can bring into the discussion, right? People's letters, their diaries, maybe even their interviews. So I think that the whole thing about what we do is trying to inject some of the color back in history, some of the blood, take it. I mean, you need all the dry stuff too, but that doesn't mean that that's all it has to be. And if that oral storyteller going from town to town in Iran today, for example, is not interesting and not engaging, he's out of a job. It doesn't matter how accurate his information is. So at the same time, you have to figure out a way to construct the narrative in a way that grabs people. And I think what grabs people is human stories that bring emotion to light. And I think those human stories are only set up by the context, right? So in other words, to understand what a terrible situation this person whose diary you're reading is in, you then have to focus on what's going on to that person in that time period, and maybe even what happened in that person's past.
And in your experience, have you found that certain types of storytelling techniques are particularly effective in engaging audiences with history?
Well, I would say if you had to say what we do most of on my podcast, we do a lot of the big picture things. But and this is in keeping with your other questions. We always try to start at the very high level. So we set the stage, as we say here in the United States theater. We set the stage for everything that's going to happen. And then at key times, we zoom in. So we did a show on the First World War. Well, there's a lot of context you have to know. Why are these people even fighting? Why are they in trenches? Why is it these particular groups of people fighting? And then you can zoom in down to the ground level. I mean, one of the stories or the letters that most affected people in that whole series we did was a letter from a soldier who had been wounded and was stranded in a shell hole and was writing his wife and children his last letter, and they found it on his body. Well, my goodness, that is a soul-searing moment to hear that and know the condition, right? In other words, if you just read that letter, it doesn't grab you the way it does if you say, well, by the way, his legs shattered, he's in a shell hole, he knows he's not going home, and he's just one single individual involved in this enormous drama involving millions of human beings. So I think you have to combine the giant elements involved to give you a sense of the scope and then show you what all of that is doing to the individuals on the ground.